In this film, I would like to talk about early land grab crimes in California and explain why there are some indications that these crimes may be linked to what we now call the cabal, the global crime syndicate. Now, when we talk about early land grabs, most people will think of the American Indians, who were pushed off their lands and experienced treaty violation after treaty violation. Now, the crimes against the American Indians were grave and they were great, but this doesn't mean there were no other land theft crimes in our history. And the period of time that I want to look at is just after California became a state. And the landowners I want to focus on are those who were given Spanish land grants by Spain or Mexico prior to the time that California became a state. These land grant owners were given this land prior to the point where Mexico ceded this land to the United States through the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo. Now, the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2nd, 1848 between Mexico and the United States, and it gave all of California to the United States. The treaty also included all of Nevada and Utah and parts of 4 other states. And then the Gadsden Purchase in 1853 added more area to the United States. If you read the treaty, you will see that in Articles 8 and 9, it states very clearly that the claims of people who were given land grants by Mexico were to be respected. Their property was to be respected. And as I'm going to show, this treaty was broken very shortly afterwards, 3 years later, through an act of Congress. At almost exactly the point in time where the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, there was a major development in California, namely the gold rush. This brought thousands of people flooding into California to seek their fortune. Wherever you have a lot of people, you need some form of government, which resulted in the formation of the state of California in 1850. Okay, now let's look at a logical train of thought. We know that the global crime syndicate called the Cabal or the New World Order or the Khazarian Mafia has existed for quite some time, since before the founding of our nation. They've been gradually working on a plan to take over the world, and one of the first things they want to take is our property. As Klaus Schwab has said, "You will own nothing and be happy." Well, the cabal would not get to its end goal of owning everything in the world just by chance. They had a long-term plan of how this would happen, and I believe that the land theft that I'm going to be describing in this video was part of that. When we see a huge new area be added to the United States, it would seem very likely that the cabal would be interested to take control of government, land, and resources in these areas. So I want to develop a possible hypothetical strategy by the cabal when they saw the opportunities that existed in the West. And then I want to look at a particular area, namely the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay region, and a particular landowner, namely the Peralta family. Even if you don't believe there is a global cabal or crime syndicate, what I will present will make a strong case that there was a criminal conspiracy to deprive the Peraltas of their land, and this, in fact, was alleged by the Peralta descendants in many court cases. They filed over 60 court cases fighting to get back their right to their own land. So here's how I imagine the cabal talking. How can we grab all the land and resources when there are over 500 privately owned ranchos which collectively own so much land? That's a problem. I know. We'll pass legislation saying that they have to prove their ownership. But that's a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Well, you don't sound like a member of our club. Since when has the law ever stopped us from doing anything? Yes, I know our unlawful legislation will eventually be overturned in court, but it'll give us time. We'll set up a land commission. We'll tell them they have to submit claims to prove their ownership of their land, and if they don't, then we'll take their land. And then when they submit the claim, We'll slow walk the process so it takes many years. And in that time, we'll send in leagues of squatters. We'll clarify that they have no right to eject squatters from the land because they haven't proven it's theirs. And some of the squatters will be clever and smart, and we'll back them up, and they'll subdivide the land and sell it, and we'll plague these rancho owners with so many problems that they'll just have to sell their land to get out of the misery that we put them in. Moreover, we will pay off some of the surveyors to do the surveys wrong and cheat them out of some of their land just in the mapping of it. If they do submit proper claims, we will have men on the ground in various departments to destroy the evidence of their claim and make sure that we conveniently lose their documentation. So if they go to court over it, they can't prove anything. If we work fast, we can get so much done that there'll be no going back. Now, in this whole process, make sure to grease the palms of everyone who helps us. People will do anything for the right price. Okay, now that I've provided my imaginary conversation amongst the demonic globalist criminals, let's look at what actually happened, shall we? And you'll find that it bears striking resemblance to the scenario I just described. In March 1851, a bill was passed in Congress, which now required all of those possessing these Spanish land grants to prove that they had rights to this land. This act was in blatant and obvious violation of the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo, which required that their land rights be respected, not requiring them to be defended and proved. To help illustrate how completely unlawful this was, imagine that a large number of people buy cars, and 20 years later or 30 years later, the United States government approaches this group of people, say about 500 people, and says, you know what? Unless you can prove that those cars are yours, we're going to take them all away from you, all 500 of you. Well, that was exactly what the California government did to the owners of the original Spanish land grants, of whom there were about 500. Now, we all realize that ownership disputes do occur from time to time, but those disputes are between two people, and they are taken to court. We have never had a situation where the land of 500 people is challenged by the government, which puts them on the defensive and says, unless all of you can prove you own that land, we're going to take it away from you. There was an act passed by the California legislature in 1856, which aimed to support the so-called rights of squatters, or as they were termed, settlers, and tried to define all land in California as public land, unless proven otherwise. Well, this is not that different from saying that a burglar has the right to your car if you cannot show a valid title for it. Now, let's take a look at the whole context so we have more insight into this legislative act. It would have been widely known throughout the state, and certainly by legislators, that squatting was a very serious problem throughout the state of California. There were many battles, even deadly ones, with squatters. There was a state of lawlessness that existed throughout the state. And the squatters actually organized themselves into associations and leagues to further their lawlessness. It was known that in Alameda County, the Squatters League included many who were, quote, among the most substantial men in the county. Are you surprised by that? In many places, squatters constituted the majority of the voters, and politicians were catering to their votes. It should not have to be said that a legitimate government does not seek to appeal to criminals, try to gain their votes, pass legislation in their favor, and depict them as enterprising settlers. Rather, a legitimate government enforces the law, protects the rights of property owners, not those of property thieves. But when the government itself is the biggest property thief, well, you might just have something different. So now that we know that the California legislature certainly would have known that squatting was a serious problem across the state, this gives us a different perspective on their legislation in support of these squatters, doesn't it? It's not hard to perceive here a hidden agenda, which was to use these settlers or squatters as a lever to leverage the lands away from the owners of the ranchos. In the same way, in the present time, we can see the cabal supporting what they call tenants' rights. Everywhere you see tenants' rights, more and more and more tenants' rights. Well, it sounds good on the surface, right? Just like it sounds good to support settlers' claims on open land. They sound good, but the reality is that you're taking rights away from someone else. In the first case, you're taking the rights away from the owners of the ranchos, and in the present day, you're taking the rights away from the property owners. Those who fall into the greedy landlord trope, the tenants' rights people, are being manipulated by the cabal to think the landlord is their enemy, failing to realize that both tenant and landlord are pawns in the land and property grab game, where the cabal, in the end, plans to take all the property and all the rights away from everyone. Now, as is stated in Beth Bagwell's book, Oakland, The Story of a City, that act of California legislature was overturned by the California Supreme Court in 1857 as unconstitutional. Now, it is true that the legal description of these pieces of property was rather informal, and we have maps that in some cases look a lot like child's drawings. However, this doesn't mean that those could all be disregarded. What should have been done, as is done in the present time in any property dispute, is you send out a surveyor, and the surveyor creates a map of the property, finds the exact demarcations of the property line, and that is what the government should have been responsible for doing for all of these properties. Instead, they required all these people to go to court to prove their claims. And they should have known, and I believe they did know, that by creating this requirement, these people would lose their lands because it was very expensive to prove your ownership. But there were other factors at work in the land theft, and when you look at all those factors combined, to me, it looks like the cabal at work. To illustrate this, let's look at a particular case, which is the theft of the lands of Domingo and Vicente Peralta in the East Bay region in California. In 1820, Luis Maria Peralta, who was born in 1759, was given one of the largest Spanish land grants in California. He was given 44,800 acres, which comprised most of the East Bay from northern San Leandro up through Albany. He called his Rancho San Antonio. In 1842, when Luis Peralta was 83 years old, he divided his land among his 4 sons, Domingo, Vicente, Antonio, and Ignacio. Domingo got the northernmost part, which is now the city of Berkeley and part of Albany. Vicente owned most of what is northern Oakland. Antonio owned most of central Oakland. And Ignacio owned the most southern part of Oakland and part of San Leandro. The burden on these rancho owners to prove their ownership would not have been so problematic if it were not for the thousands of gold miners who came to the state and saw the land, unfortunately, as free for the taking. They didn't come with the understanding that there were large landowners already present. Rather, they came with the idea that this was all open land, unowned by anyone, free for the taking. But this popular attitude alone would not have led to land theft. Rather, it was the failure of those in government who were supposed to enforce the laws that ended up instead supporting the land theft. We can see this when we follow the phenomenon that led to the loss of land, which was the squatter phenomenon. If we read this paragraph as regards the rights that early court decisions gave squatters, we can see that these court decisions were unconstitutional. They were a violation of the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo once again. The treaty required that all land grant owners were to be dealt with as basically U.S. citizens with property. In what world in the United States does any property owner have to endure a squatter living on their property until they can prove that they own the land. That's not how we ever have done anything in the United States. If the property of these land grant owners were being respected as the treaty required, the court cannot state that squatters have any right to be on that land until a dispute is resolved. There is no dispute. The court's position basically was that every land grant was in dispute, and this was, on its face, a violation of the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo. As well, common sense dictates that you cannot be honoring two different claims to the same piece of land simultaneously. You can't do it. Because if you say that someone has a right to squat, you're basically saying that the owner of that land does not have right to use part of their own land. We have a saying that possession is 9/10 of the law, and these rancho owners possess their lands by living on them. Moreover, if you give rights to squatters, where do those rights end? Can the squatter break into the owner's house violently and say, hey, this is my house, get out? Could they bring an armed contingent onto the guy's property and chase him and all his family off of their land completely? Well, that's basically what happened to Domingo Peralta. A group of armed squatters came in with a cannon and insisted they would defend their right to his land unto the death. And Domingo tried to fight them, and who was arrested and put in jail? The owner. Domingo Peralta was jailed for 6 months for trying to get the violent squatters off his land. But if you think that story is outrageous as far as squatters go, you ain't seen nothing yet. In the 1910 court case, Peralta versus the state of California, filed by the descendants of the Peralta family, they claimed there was a conspiracy to deprive them of their land, and it was led by a squatters league, which included Horace Carpentier. Now, if there's one thing we know about criminals and how they prey on people, it's that they look for opportunities. They look for openings. They look for areas where they can exploit the situation because maybe the law is not clear enough. Enter into the story 3 men. These men were Horace Carpentier, Edson Adams, and Andrew Moon. And they were sophisticated men who came from the East Coast. Horace Carpentier was an attorney who had recently graduated from Columbia University. These men are lauded as the founders of the city of Oakland, but they were actually some of the biggest criminals in this area at this time period. The story about what happened to the Peraltas and their land becomes clear when we go to the county recorder's office and look through the old land deeds for the region. If we go back to the very first deeds that were recorded after California became a state, we find that neither Domingo nor Vicente sold any land to Horace Carpentier or Edson Adams or Andrew Moon. We do find that Vicente Peralta's first land sale was to John Clark, as well as 3 other men, John Hayes, John Caperton, and Joseph Irving. And this was for land in what is now downtown Oakland, which is the center area on this map. Now, even though Clark and his associates had legitimately bought the land and laid claim to it, Horace Carpentier, Edson Adams, and Andrew Moon moved onto it, squatted on it, and not only did they set up there, but they started to divide the area up into parcels and create streets. The 3 of them brazenly hired a surveyor, Kellersberger, to do a survey of the area of Oakland where they were squatting, and they created basically a map of a whole city without ever owning anything lawfully. This unscrupulous survey was mentioned in a court case in an 1882 law journal. And then they sold that land that they didn't own. They didn't have a right to not wait for a decision on the Peralta's land claim provided by the Land Commission. Even the courts that were supporting the squatters' right to squat on the land did not support their right to sell that land. I went to the Oakland Records Office to look up the records of land sales in these early years, and what I found is quite sad. The very first land sales ever recorded, which should be of the Peraltas selling their land, were not. They were of these three men, Horace Carpentier and Edson Adams and Andrew Moon, selling the Peraltas land. So the next thing I did was I made some notes of all the lots sold by Carpentier, Adams, and Moon. And there are literally hundreds of them. Look at all these. They sold many lots on each block. Sometimes they sold an entire block. Block 92, block 115, they sold the whole block. And, I just made page after page of notes of all the lots that these criminals sold without owning any of this. When some of you try to get a land patent for your land and you do your chain of title and you go to the recorder's office with your land patent, they say they won't record it because it's not lawful. And yet there was a recorder, more than one recorder, who recorded all these hundreds of sales that were totally unlawful because the people selling the land didn't own it. So how does that happen, that a recorder is willing to do this? Greasing the palms again is what I believe is happening here. These people are all involved in this corruption, in this conspiracy to deprive the Peraltas of their land. To understand this, we need to understand the context. It would have been widely known amongst those living and working in the area that there was a controversy about these lands and that there were people that bought the land, namely John Clark, John Coffee Hayes, John Caperton, and Joseph Irving on the one hand, and that there were the squatters, Carpentier and Adams and Moon, on the other, as well as other squatters. So the people who worked with and for the squatters cannot claim that they were ignorant of the matter. Moreover, I find it very interesting that the surveyor who unscrupulously surveyed the lands unlawfully held, whose name was Julius Kellersberger, was found almost at the very beginning of the very first deeds ever recorded in Alameda County, on page 6 of the very first book in 1853. Guess who was there? Julius Kellersberger. He was already selling lots in this area where the squatters were. So this suggests to me that he was in on it. He was participating. He was benefiting from these crimes. But there were many other squatters throughout Domingo and Vincente's lands, not just those in this one small area of what today is downtown Oakland. In fact, the area was so rife with them that in one of Domingo Peralta's land sales, the actual legal land description contains a reference to a squatter's house. In this article from February of 1854, there is reference to the number of squatters on Domingo and Vincente's land. The article cites a total of about 2,800 squatters in 3 different groups, of whom about 1,000 purchased land from Moon, Adams, and Carpentier. It appears that Domingo Peralta had much worse problems with squatters than Vincente. In a deposition that Domingo did in May 1861 for a court case where he was attempting to get back possession of his ranch, he testified that he had to leave his ranch because it was, quote, carried off by the squatters in 1852. Domingo further testified that the first squatter was Victor Castro, who entered and squatted upon his land in 1849 without his knowledge. This is very sad because guess who Victor Castro was? He was another owner of a Spanish land grant. The rancho just to the north of Domingo, Rancho El Sobrante, from which the city of El Sobrante takes its name, was owned by Victor Castro. Note that this Wikipedia article on Castro states that, quote, he warred with Americans who squatted on his land. I guess he didn't want squatters on his land, but he sure didn't mind squatting on other people's land. Now, I hope you're not surprised to find out who was connected to Victor Castro. Yes, that's right, Horace Carpentier. He made a deal with Victor Castro. See, we're starting to see how all these things are connected. When those who had lawfully purchased land from Domingo and Vincente divided those lands amongst themselves in July 1856, there was also a lot of other evidence of squatters throughout that territory, as evidenced in these deeds of partition. These holdings had been divided into 96 plots as shown on this map drawn by the surveyor Kellersberger. And in the deeds, we see references that many of these plots were quote-unquote claimed by others. Let's look at one particular partition deed as an example. It stated that George Aldrich claims plot number 2. It's further stated that Thomas Beale claims plot number 10, that John McCorkey claims plot number 13, and it's further stated that the Provost brothers claimed plot number 33, Tubbs claimed plot number 12, J.A. Hobart claims plot number 6, Bertrand claimed plot number 41, Bragmere claimed plot number 7, and that Alden and Soule claimed plot number 45, and that A. Navier claimed plot 47, Provost claimed plot 43, and that Randall claimed plot 64, that Walker claimed plot 66, and Robinson claimed plot 67, and A.W. Bassel claimed plot 76, and J. Corrin claimed plot 73, and Smith claimed plot 72, and that Shattuck, by the way, Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley is named after this squatter Shattuck. Shattuck claimed plot number 68, Maxwell claimed plot 84, Leonardo claimed plot 70, Blake Street in Berkeley claimed plot 69. So all in all, this one partition deed mentioned 20 plots of land that were claimed by squatters. When I went through all 7 partition deeds, I found a total of 62 plots of land out of a total of 96 existing plots. 62 were being claimed by squatters, so you can appreciate the huge legal problems that these folks were facing, who rightfully owned all of this land. Now, notice that the area of downtown Oakland is not included in this plot layout because that was sold early on to the John Clark Party, which included John Coffee Hayes, John Caperton, and Joseph Irving. As it turns out, John Coffee Hayes was a former Texas Ranger, and he was very well known. In fact, there's a feature film about him. He moved out here and became a sheriff of San Francisco. Now, after talking about the other squatters, let's get back to Horace Carpentier and his little gang of criminals. The biggest problem that the Peralta family faced was their legal situation. The legal costs alone would have led them to lose all their land. But there was more that caused them to lose their land, namely Horace Carpentier. Now, as Domingo and Vicente Peralta had legal problems, they needed an attorney. So who did they get for their attorney? Horace Carpentier! Can you believe it? He actually offered to be Domingo Peralta's lawyer, even though he was trying to steal land from Domingo and Vicente. He offered to be their lawyer, and they accepted. It is hard to believe, but Domingo and Vicente were trusting, good-hearted men, and they did not suspect the evil that lie in the heart of Horace Carpentier, how shrewd and conniving and manipulative and truly criminal he was. You know, what I've learned in the last few years about the cabal as I've observed their crimes and their lies and their propaganda and more lies and propaganda, I began to realize for the cabal, their religion is lies. This is really their religion, telling lies. From the moment they get up in the morning to the moment they go to bed, they're telling lies. They probably have dreams in lies. And Horace Carpentier followed after that pattern. He did not work for them. He worked their cases to cause them to lose. Let's look at some things that the Peralta descendants said about Horace Carpentier in their 1910 lawsuit against the state of California. The Peraltas accused Carpentier and those of working with him of making and procuring false and fraudulent surveys of the boundaries of their ranch and of mutilating, concealing, and destroying the evidence of their title to these ranches. And they say that he deceived them while pretending to be acting in their behalf. And he also removed documents from the keeper of the archives in Monterey and made sure that they could not get them. And he removed documents from the court files, and he removed documents from the county clerk's office, and that he and other conspirators tore off, removed, and destroyed a part of the last page with the signature of the governor. The Peraltas also alleged that Carpenter and his co-conspirators intentionally made a false survey of the lands of Ignacio Peralta, which caused him to lose part of his ranch, and that they made a false survey for the part of the land of Antonio Peralta, causing him to lose part of his ranch. Can you see the pattern here? They're trying to defraud every single of the 4 sons of the Peralta family, and that's not all that these folks did. They're just 4 of the 500 rancho owners throughout the state, many of whom were also deprived of their lands through other frauds and crimes. What's really sad is that the Peraltas apparently trusted this man for quite a while and had no idea he was working against them. It was kind of hard to believe, since he was squatting on their land, or land that they had sold to John Clark. But they were good people, and good people often have too much trust and don't understand the evil that's about in the world. Now, Horace Carpentier appeared to be a very slippery, snake-like figure who concealed his crimes and had amazing powers of manipulation, and essentially got everything he wanted. And he was enormously successful. Horace, almost as soon as he got to the area, is said to have begun mingling with the local elites. This description of Horace from a website on Berkeley history says that almost as soon as he arrived, he was well into local political life. Horace also ended up founding the city of Oakland, becoming its first mayor. Some of the election was alleged to have ballot stuffing. Are we surprised? He also was a state assemblyman, and he was involved in connecting the Transcontinental Railroad to the Oakland waterfront. Oh, and by the way, he also owned the Oakland waterfront. He also had a monopoly on the ferry service at the waterfront. He was also a trustee for Durant's Academy. He ran the telegraph company. He owned the 12th Street Bridge. He became a director of the Bank of California. He was the chair of the State Prison Commission, and he was the 9th richest man in Alameda County. With the proceeds from all his games of deceit, lies, and conniving, he made a legal purchase of a large rancho in California. He was the largest landowner in the state of California. Meanwhile, what was the outcome for the Peraltas? Well, Domingo lost all but 30 acres of his original 12,000. And after his death in 1865, those 30 acres were lost as well. Vicente managed to keep 700 acres for a while, but all of that is gone today, and you cannot see a trace of the houses of either of these men. The 2 brothers submitted their claims to the California Land Commission, but they slow-walked the process. They were taking 17 years to come to their decisions there. Now, the claim of the Peraltas to their land was finally validated in 1856 in the U.S. Supreme Court, and they were finally given a land patent for their land, but not until 1877, after both of them had already passed away, Domingo in 1865 and Vicente in 1871. Now, notice that the U.S. Supreme Court case decision states very clearly that the assumption needs to be that the grantees have a valid land grant, that anyone who wants to deny that has the burden of proof upon them. And that is exactly what was not done by the California legislature and the California courts. But it's important to remember that it was not just the Peralta family that lost their land. Something similar happened to most of the ranchos in the state of California. So, was it the cabal, the global crime syndicate, that was at work in this land grab that took place over the entire state of California? Well, let's look at some of the evidence of all the levels of corruption. First, at the highest level, the U.S. Congress passed the unconstitutional California Land Act in 1851, which violated the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo. In 1856, the California legislature passed an act whose aim was to protect settlers, meaning squatters, by stating that all lands in the state were public lands unless proven otherwise. Congress and California legislature would have known very well about the squatter problem in California, and thus would have known that their legislation was supporting these criminals. Then the Public Land Commission was formed to examine land claims, and this land commission slow-walked the claims so that they took an average of 17 years to complete. The criminal squatters formed many associations or leagues across California and held regular meetings. In Alameda County, the Squatters League included many who were called among the most substantial men in the county. These worked together to create problems for land grant owners so that these would sell out cheap. This is known as racketeering, and it is a crime. It was alleged that the U.S. Surveyor General for California engaged in fraud, doing intentionally incorrect surveys. Julius Kellersberger, the surveyor for the East Bay, unscrupulously did a survey for Carpenter and others, surveying lands that it would have been common knowledge at the time that those men did not own. When Carpenter and his accomplices began selling lots they didn't own, it looked like Kellersberger was in on the deal, as he too was recorded as selling these lots. Carpenter, Adams, and Moon sold hundreds of lots that they didn't own and were responsible for bringing in at least 1,000 squatters onto the Peralta family rancho. The courts in the area gave support to those squatting on the land, and in doing so also violated the Treaty of Guadelupe Hidalgo. In his dealings with the Peralta family, where Carpenter both worked to steal their land from them while simultaneously serving as their attorney, pretending to work on their behalf, we see the very same type of deceit and duplicity that characterizes the cabal. In the present day, we've seen many examples of the cabal both covertly creating a problem and then stepping up and offering a solution that in fact is worse than the problem, but which people in a desperate situation who are ignorant of the hidden agenda and deceit may tend to accept. The county recorder's office or clerk's office did not stop Carpenter and his accomplices from officially recording sales of lands that they did not own. Hundreds of lots they didn't own were officially recorded. Fraudulent elections were held. It was said of Carpenter's run for mayor that he got more votes than there were voters. Ditto with regard to election fraud in connection with Carpenter's run for state assembly. Carpenter was well connected to many of the power elites in his area at the time. The Peralta family allegations indicate that the county clerk's office did not stop Carpenter from destroying Peralta documents which were on file there, suggesting they may have been complicit in those crimes. Likewise, the Peralta family alleges that Carpenter destroyed documents at the court, suggesting that because the court did not stop him from doing that, they may have been complicit in those crimes. Ditto with regard to documents in the Office of Archives in Monterey, California. So what does the evidence show? I believe the evidence does point to a large-scale, widespread conspiracy to deprive California Rancho owners of their lands. Was this the cabal? I leave this for you to decide. What remains of the Peralta lands and homes today? Well, in the Fruitvale district of Oakland, where you find Peralta Hacienda Park, you will find the last remaining section of Antonio Peralta's ranch, including his house, which is open as a museum. It has many interesting displays as well as some documents for visitors to look through. Unfortunately, there are some cabal-originated woke politics associated with Peralta Hacienda Park, which characterizes the brainwashed Bay Area. In San Leandro, Ignacio Peralta's home still stands, and today is the Altamira Women's Club. However, nothing remains of the homesteads or ranches of Domingo or Vicente. You can find the last remnants of them as street names in Berkeley and Oakland.